Hey everyone, this time on Tim Talks Audio, we go over dynamic processing. This video is a little bit of the back to basics style, where we're going to go over different dynamic processors. There's 4 that we're going to go over today, and really we're going to go over how they're similar, but work in what I like to say opposite directions. We're going to be going over gates, expanders, compressors, and limiters, very basically, and how they work. And if you want to get into all of the controls, I have other videos. I'll make sure that there's links in the description. But for now, let's dive into the DAW. Okay, so here we are inside of our session, and like we said, we're going to be talking about dynamic processors. Dynamic processors are plugins that we use to limit or extend the dynamic range, or the difference between the loudest parts of our signal and the quietest parts of our signal. That is the dynamic range. And we're not talking about just like noise floor or just silence. We're talking about transients, or the initial spikes of certain elements of instruments, like drums in our example today. When a snare drum hits, it has an initial transient, the start of the note. And then there is the sustain of the note. And sure, there's decay and release, but we're not getting into that. Dynamic processors allow you to adjust the differences between those peaks at your transients and your sustained source material or note material, and change it from maybe something really drastic to something more drastic, or even less drastic, where you compress or limit everything down. If you want to make things even further away from each other, your loudest parts from your quietest parts, you're going to go for an expander or a gate. And let's start with expansion. Expansion takes the difference between the loudest parts of your signal and the quietest parts of your signal, and allows you to actually separate them even more by expanding that range. An expander, it works just like a compressor, but instead of saying anything over a threshold, it is now anything under a threshold gets pushed down a little bit more, as opposed to anything that goes over the threshold, like with a compressor, the loud parts get squished down. That's what a compressor does. It'll squish the loud parts. An expander will take the quiet parts and push those down just a little bit more. So when you're trying to clean up your tracks, maybe a compressor isn't the way to go. You want to put an expander first. You want to get all of the things you don't want, the inaudible, maybe some background noise or bleed from different mics, further away from your signal. You want to use an expander. But let's say you want to go extreme and you want to cut everything off. Then you reach for a gate. Now, a gate is just a hard expander. It says that after a certain threshold, if signals are not loud enough, don't play them whatsoever. An expander can say, sure, play them a little bit, but turn it down a lot. A gate says, I don't want it at all. Now, the Studio One stock gate, if we turn it on here, it does have a range in here, but the range goes to -72, where if we turn the expander on and check its range, it also goes to -72. I forgot. But it does allow for some of the signal to still come through a little. The way that it can allow some of that signal through is with the ratio, and how much you turn this down is how far you get into that expansion or the reduction of your signal. And you can see now, as I'm adjusting this and I get close to 1.5 on my ratio, my reduction meter starts to reduce. Here I am at 1 to 1.3 on my ratio, and I'm getting a little bit more than 24 dB of reduction. So if I bring this right to 1.1, I'm now getting about 12 dB of reduction. It's a really small amount, and our range is ridiculous, but our signals are only going to get pushed down a little because our ratio is small. But if we crank this all the way up, essentially we turn it into a gate, just like you can do with a compressor. If you take a compressor and put its ratio all the way up, you're essentially turning it into a limiter. And a limiter is just like a gate. A gate says anything below the threshold, I don't want to hear it. With a limiter, anything that gets close to the threshold, you're limited. You are not allowed to go louder than this point, and you get cut off. And sometimes if you do this really drastically, you'll get some distortion, and not good distortion. The square wave kind of nasty sounding distortion. So use limiters with a little bit of extra caution. Now let's compare the low level stuff and the high level stuff to one another. Let's start with our expander and we'll put this back to kind of the default state. Here's the default as it was. And we'll also do the same thing with the gate. The only thing that I'm doing differently is I'm taking the attack and release times, and in the instance of the gate, the hold, and I'm turning them all the way down. I want you guys to hear this instantly happening. Let's start with our extremes and end with our extremes. We're going to go gate. We're working on our drum bus, and this is, again, it's one of the songs I've been working on, slow drums, so it's really going to emphasize what's happening and why it's happening. So with our gate, anything below our threshold, and we'll just kind of put this a bit drastically up here, it's going to get cut off, clamped down, and we're not going to hear it. Take a listen. So you can hear it's real snappy, it's real choppy, it's just getting rid of our very low level stuff. And again, I do have it at an extreme setting, but you're hearing only the transients of the kick and snare are coming through. If I adjust the threshold down, we'll get a little bit more, but as the signals come down, it's just going to get cut off. That's our extreme. Now let's go into the more gentle. We'll go over to the expander, which is in the default settings. Let's dial something in where we're going to reduce all of the extra noise, but we're not going to get rid of it. We just want to separate the transients from the sustained sounds of the drums. Again, this is an overemphasized example, but you can probably start to see where this can have a very strong foothold. I use expanders all the time when I mix live shows, especially on drums. I don't want all of the bleed of the main kick and snare happening or coming through the PA, or even in our records when we're mixing at home. I don't need the tom mics that can sort of hear the snare and the kick and everything else that's going on, adding extra signal to my source. If I want to clean it up, I'll throw expanders on the channels of my drums and usually do them first so that I can just get all of the bleed low and out of the way. I can dial it in so that just the transient and the tone of the toms in this example can ring through, and when they're not being played, it's just pushed down out of the way and cleaned up. Now let's switch it up and we'll go to our loud things. We want to set our compressor and our limiter to say, I don't want you any louder than this point. So we'll start with our more gentle option, which is compression. So a compressor will handle the loud parts of your signal, saying, you know what, you are loud and I'm okay with that, but you have to kind of rein it in a little. You need to sit within a certain parameter, where with an expander it says, okay, well, here's your quiet material, and I don't want to get rid of you. I just want you different and separated from the louder parts. So an expander is kind of like a compressor, and a gate is kind of like a limiter. And let's switch over to the limiter. The limiter is the opposite of a gate. Anything that tries to go over the threshold, you're cut off. You're not allowed to go through. Limiter has very similar controls to a compressor, but just like we saw with our expander, the expander has a ratio just like the compressor does, but the gate and limiters don't. It's way more extreme. Here's your point. This is your threshold. You don't go louder than this with a limiter, or you don't get heard if you're lower than this, like you do with a gate. So let's take a quick listen to compression and limiting. I think we've gone over this a bunch of different times, so we'll go real fast. Here's the compressor. So you could probably hear it was because of the fast settings we have on now with fastest attack and fastest release, it's softening the hits of the kick and snare. Now let's switch over to limiting and saying, you're not louder than this. And when I turn this on, you can see I have my gain cranked all the way up because we can do that. We can just push into a limiter and it won't let things get louder than wherever the ceiling is set. And the ceiling is typically set like this. This is generally how you're going to see it by default. I think I'd change the release. Doesn't matter. Let's listen to a limiter. So there you go. That's a quick comparison of our dynamic processors. Gates expanders are equal or inverse to compressors and limiters. It's a new way to think of the tools that we have because a lot of people, at least from what I've seen, don't talk about things like this. That there are comparisons and there are opposites of some of the tools that we have. Maybe you guys learned through this video that a gate is like a limiter, and then an expander is like a compressor. They really are the same, they're just working in opposite directions. That's all for now. If you found anything informative, and in this one I kinda hope you did, please like and share the video. Want to talk more dynamic processing or just tips and tricks? Head over to the Discord. There's a link down in the description. I'd love to work with you on your next project, so let's get that started. Reach out to me on Discord or head to timflansbaum.com. And if you have a question, ask it in the comments and I'll answer it in a future video. Thanks for watching.